Good afternoon, everyone. Calling to order the Policy Committee meeting for February 19th. On our agenda today is Policy ICA, the school year number of days and holidays, and Policy IKA, grading and reporting. So starting with ICA, is that you? Excellent.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is James Torrance. I'm the Staff Specialist for Strategy and Compliance, and I am the Principal Staff Person in charge of creating the school calendar. Board Policy ICA is converting Board Rule 70401.1. This rule actually codifies the education article, which is Article 7-103, which requires 180 days or 1,080 hours for a school year, and then also the COMA regulation that is listed on the PowerPoint slide also does list the same requirements plus the waiver requirements we must have for the state. To give you an idea, the instructional day and hours requirement is 180 days of instruction and also 1,080 hours at minimum. To give you background, for a school day to count as an instructional day, we need at least 3 hours of the day. Also, schools are not permitted to open up on holidays, Saturdays, or Sundays. And also, New Song Academy will fall under the New Initiative School where they can operate year-round. To give you an idea, these are the COMA required holidays.
Just to clarify, they can operate year-round, but they still have to follow the state holidays like Good Friday and Easter Monday.
Yes, okay. That's what I was about to get to.
Oh, okay.
They still can operate year-round, and they can also have to adhere to the state-required holidays. To give you an idea, New Song starts in July, and then starts in after Labor Day and ends in early July. And within that time, they have 2 to 3 week breaks built into their calendar.
And they're not our only extended year charter.
They're not our only extended year charter. There are approximately 3. And then there are 6 total, which we applied for the Labor Day waiver for. And then we also have the 6 schools, or the 100% schools, which are 5. So we have a total of 11 schools along with New Song that operates outside of the traditional calendar.
Thank you.
In terms of changes to these days, we put in there that the current practice that if we do make adjustments to the school year, we would notify the board and have approval by the board to actually make such adjustments, and also that we know that we have to apply for a waiver and know that we can open up on holidays with the permission of the State Board of Education. Also, for again, changes to the number of days within the regulation, we have language where we have to show demonstrated effort in our actual calendar when we make modifications to our calendar to meet the 180-day requirement. And from there, once we do make those adjustments, we will align our quarters, our assessment windows, and also our report card dates as well. And with that, we have our engagement, so we're going to reach out to PCAP, CCAC, and then we're also looking at youth groups because we know students are trying to understand how we construct the calendar, and also educate the public on why the calendar is important for two things. 1, professional development, 2, for instruction, and as well as breaks for staff.
So just suggesting reaching out to like the Boys and Girls Clubs and the Y, especially around like New Song if they're going to have different vacations throughout the year or time away from school, to make sure that the after school and out of school time programming is ready to help support the calendar and interface.
What does engagement look like with the engagement groups? What is that process like?
So typically with the groups, so if it's the charters, we know that if it's important to them, we'll provide them with the regulations, the actual PowerPoint presentation. If they have questions, they can email me directly. I normally am a person in the face for my policies. I will actually go to the actual groups meetings. We don't actually schedule time when we interrupt their time. We ask for permission to join their time. And for me also, I've done focus groups where I've invited random sets of principals and teachers and people actually in the work to give feedback, because I know that if anything's implemented here and needs to be communicated to schools, it's better to come from people who are actually in the building.
So it's like taking a draft of the calendar to them and asking for their input, or is it just general? I'm trying to understand the process.
So
of
generally,
the
when we present the
stakeholder
calendar,
engagement.
it's public on the website for feedback. I usually each year get around 200 to 300 emails where people give feedback, and most of the time the feedback is didn't know this, or it's mainly a process of educating them on with how we constructed the calendar. Because often many of the questions that they ask can be answered by just telling them what the law requires us to. Because often people don't know that the law requires us to open up on certain holidays. For instance, every year I field questions about Veterans Day. Many people know that we have to observe Veterans Day, but we don't have to close for Veterans Day.
And we are not, by policy, we're technically not, how do I want to word it? So the engagement, are we required to engage stakeholder groups per our current policies, or do we just welcome stakeholder engagement to make sure that our calendar is suitable for all of the parties that are involved?
I can say by practice, we reach out to stakeholder groups because one of the things we try to do is make sure that in this process of creating and structuring the calendar, it's more so an educational perspective of why we have to do certain things, especially when we do vet it internally in offices. One of the things that we look over is does this affect AP windows? Does this affect graduation validation? How does this work in the scope of how the school building runs? So it's more intense than we normally do, but it's also, for the past couple of years, I can tell you that a big disruption to the calendar is that we haven't received testing windows in advance of constructing the calendar. So we're preparing for what those windows look like outside of what MSD communicates.
I'm hopeful that one of the bargaining groups is our largest, the BTU, and they'll be engaged in this process also.
So by law, we cannot negotiate regarding the calendar, but we can actually provide it for staff to provide feedback.
That's why I was asking about engagement. So what does engagement look like? I know we can't, but that's why I was asking. So I hope that we do engage them prior to the calendar being adopted.
Josh? I'm sorry, Commissioner Lund?
You're fine. Going back to the engagement piece, I do think that that's a big component, especially for students, like you said already. I think that if ASCBC would be one of the engagement groups being a key stakeholder, but I also think that it would be better if you or your team would not come to one of our executive board meetings. My best bet would you guys, a bigger audience would be to come to our General Assemblies. Our next General Assembly is February 23rd, and I think that would be more impactful, and that would reach a lot more students, and you can get a lot more questions and a lot more, ideas about it.
I welcome that.
But I do have a question. So, like you said, we're not legally allowed to bargain with the BTU or other things. So how is it possible for us to ever engage with them regarding things like this? Like, how is it?
So generally, the staff and the public can provide feedback. One of the things that we can do is provide the calendar so that they're aware of where we're going to do with how we planned out the calendar. They can provide feedback, but we can't negotiate on moving this day to that day. It's more of a conversation of this is why we are doing this because, but not so that you can actually say push. It's not a bargaining. It's not I will exchange. It's not an exchange. We're not trying to exchange for anything.
No, so you would just, like any other stakeholder, you would just be telling them the arrangements or, okay.
Informing, and then to tell you that some of the ideas I've gotten for the calendar have come from families.
In regard to the process with last year, can you explain exactly what we did with President's Day last year? And then we came back this year to vote on adjustments to that. Can we talk about it if we can't use specific holidays that I just saw in the presentation?
I can explain that. When we construct the calendar, and in the construction, we are not allowed to preemptively use those holidays. We can request a conditional waiver to actually use the holiday if we need it for inclement weather or natural disaster. So in the initial construction and the approved calendar by the board, it has to be marked as a holiday, but the board can vote to actually request a waiver from MSCE to actually waive that holiday so we can open.
So we asked for a waiver for that day in the event that we had to use it for inclement weather.
And in fact, the state board chair commended Baltimore City for asking for that waiver well in advance this year.
But the challenge is, so this is all stems from the short timeline because of the executive order, the governor's executive order that makes us start after Labor Day and end by June 15th. It's fitting the days in is very, very difficult. And so what the guidance was from the state, last year the state legislature passed a law that said we could go 5 days after June 15th, but MSDE interpreted that to mean that they would only give us a waiver from the 180-day requirement. If we needed more than the 5 days, they would only give us a waiver from the 180-day requirement if we demonstrated we took 3 days within the calendar first. So that's why we initially marked that we would take President's Day, but obviously we would prefer to avoid taking President's Day if we at all can avoid it, because it's hard to get, there'll be challenges with both teacher and student attendance. And then central office has to be open too, so we'd have to find another day to make up for staff who that was a vacation day for them.
How were some of the other systems working through the executive order? I'm curious to know.
I mean, you probably know better than I, you've looked at more of them, but a number of them have given up spring break. They,
So-
for the most
Well, I
part,
know
don't have spring break.
I know we had to, and actually added 5 minutes to the school day for every school in Baltimore County. But I'm curious to know how other systems
So
are
other
working
districts
around this
are-
challenge.
Other districts are looking at holidays as well, especially to make it up. Even, I will be honest, that some of our rural counties, so Dorchester actually requested a waiver for President's Day, and then also another county, I believe, Talbot County requested one as well, and then the state board gave permission to the superintendent to a blanket permission to the superintendent to grant requests for President's Day just in case because of inclement weather. So the reality is that all of the LEAs are feeling it, and that everyone is now cutting their spring break to Thursday, Friday, and Monday to account for that. So it's changing, and then other districts are suffering because they are changing their professional development calendars.
So to that end, when we talk about engagement, we certainly have families who live on the county line, whether actually on the county line or not, and have children attending Baltimore County schools and Baltimore City schools. Is there conversation with Baltimore County to ensure our calendars align so that the region has predictable vacations and time off at all?
So we have not engaged Baltimore County. Baltimore County has more holidays than we actually do have.
Right.
So if we were to align, we would actually shorten the number of available instructional days that we have and potentially risk losing a lot of professional development.
So the other question around that, and certainly my personal is to have kids in school as much as possible, but have we communicated with the faith-based community to ensure that we are not overly emphasizing and promoting Christianity over other religions that may be widely practiced in our area?
We have not, because to be pretty simple, the state law requires these Christian holidays, especially for Easter Monday. Those are things, because it's a Catholic state, or observed, especially with Good Friday.
Easter Monday is, we're going to call a capitalistic holiday and a Christian.
Yes.
Come on. You got up already.
Yeah.
So,
We've got the Friday before Easter and the Monday after.
yeah.
We have the Friday before and the Monday after.
Christmas is required, so.
We're restricted because if you look at winter break is from Christmas Eve until after New Year's Day. So you get to from December 24th to January 1st.
I mean, I think the real challenge
Mike.
is the real challenge is the beginning and end date. I mean, if we just had to start after Labor Day, but then could go into June, that wouldn't be as challenging. It's the fitting in between, and some years are worse than others. This year is harder than last year. Next year is even harder, right, in order to fit it, because it has to do with, like, there was an election day this year, so that's one more day that you have to fit in. Sometimes where the holidays fall make it harder, because if you've got a holiday that's on a Tuesday, it doesn't really make sense to be open on a Monday if you're going to be closed for the rest of that week. So some weeks, some years are harder than others. This is a fairly hard year.
To give you an idea of how hard it is, so in Baltimore City, we're now aligned with the presidential cycle. So traditionally, the Baltimore City primary is in June, but now it is now in April. So we now lose a day in April. So if you couple that with potentially having the same year that is a Baltimore presidential election and spring break in April, then we lose a maximum of 7 days in 1 month, just there.
So have we looked at doing an expansion of the school day, 5 to 15 minutes per school day, to help get us another space?
So I think, I think we can look at it. I think there's cost challenges with it. I think what we're hoping is there's legislation moving this year in the legislature to allow us to go beyond June 15th more clearly. I mean, the legislature, I think, felt pretty confident that what they did last year was clear enough, but the state's interpretation of it was very conservative. So I think that they're trying to make more clear this year that the LEAs have more freedom over, I think, start and end dates. As the current draft would give us freedom over both when LEAs start and when they end. So I think we're hopeful that something will come through there. I mean, again, my preference would be the thing I worry about most is the end date. If you want to be particular about the start date, if that's really important to certain people, then we could live with that if we could have freedom over the end date. You just can't do both.
Also look at it and be proactive in the event that we don't. I mean, legislation just went through in the Senate, I think, right? So it's now in Ways and Means in the House. So I think it's important to just look at what would it look like and cost us, to your point, to perhaps extend the school day,
Right.
Maybe by 5 to 10 minutes, something, perhaps.
Look at, I think there was a fairly substantial cost in the county, I want to say, when they looked at it.
They had a cost issue, and then also we
I
have.
sense we're going to get an answer to that question.
Hi.
Yes.
My name is Lori Branch Cooper, and I'm legal counsel, and I've been working with James on this issue. Part of the challenge that we have is that our bargaining contracts, particularly BTU, limits the school day. And so that's one challenge that we have. And there's some other restrictions in the BTU contract that kind of have limited us as it relates to breaks and to your question about engagement with the BTU. So those are some of the challenges in modifying the school day right now.
So that's something we as a board might put a pin in for the next contract negotiation.
Yes, and then you'd have to think about how you prioritize that versus other things we might want.
Right, absolutely. Oh, if we could all only, if wishes were fishes, we'd all be well fed. Exactly. Yeah, and even looking at the conversation on the national level that's looking for those states that have transitioned Columbus Day into Indigenous Peoples Day, but make that a day off that's held during the election day so that no one is working on that day, so we can truly have more equal access to the polls and things like that, would be a great reason to investigate figuring out how we can find another day in the calendar. So, all right. Any other questions? All right. Thank you. Appreciate your work.
Good afternoon. I'm Rachel Pfeiffer, Executive Director of College and Career Readiness.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm Danny Heller, Manager of College and Career Readiness, and I've been the project manager for our grading policy work this year. So it's a pleasure to be here and receive your feedback on this policy. Just a background on the grading policy. The district instituted our first grading policy in 2011. Generally, the way it currently looks is each school is allowed to create their own grading policy pursuant to some very general guidelines that our district has put in place. So, for example, they have to follow a common GPA scale. they have to, especially in the high schools, have 40% of their first quarter grade. A semester grade is 40% of first quarter, 40% of second quarter, and 20% of the final exam. So there's some very vague guidelines that schools have to comply to, but they have their own grading policies.
Why did we choose that, excuse me, why did we make that decision in 2011 to allow schools to kind of draft that? We have a general, right? We have the foundation, and then they can tailor it to fit their needs per school. How did we come to that?
I didn't work here in 2011, so I don't want to speak to that in detail. I will say that when you look at the district statement and the decks from the time, it mirrored our district's philosophy around school autonomy. So the process that we...
Can I clarify that, Denny? So you're saying the 40-40-20 is to give schools autonomy?
So one of the things that schools that there's no guidance around is how much classwork counts, how much homework counts, how much assessments count, how much exams count. So there are some very vague rules. So yes, there were some bounds, but I think in terms of what grades look like at each school, schools previously had a lot of leeway in terms of setting grading policies that work for their school communities.
So a question about the 40-40-20, if it's okay with you, if we jump it along the way. What about for the content areas that don't have common formative assessments, don't have end-of-course exams, so that 40% at School A is a completely different battery than the 40% at School B?
So in that scenario, the exam grade doesn't necessarily count. So then it's just the first and second semester count equally.
So
And that's been
really,
laid
this
out.
is then a grading policy for English and math?
I would,
Because we haven't seen common formative assessments in the curriculum in any other content areas.
so as I believe, so the current grading policy doesn't necessarily dictate which assessments are used to count up for that 40-40-20. So it's not it doesn't say it has to be formative assessments that count for that 40. It does, so it's written to apply to all class types.
I think we might have another voice of expertise joining us.
Sorry, so
Always appreciate more minds.
Hi, I'm
Not that
Stacey
Danny's not
Davis.
enough.
I'm from Teaching and Learning. This 2011 policy aligned with the implementation of our first electronic grade book. So that 40-40-20 in part was due to making sure that we had a calculation for those courses where there was an exam, and like the semester courses, for example. When in courses like fine arts, music, the non-English language arts, and math, if there's no exam, then that calculation just defaults to a 50-50. But you're right, it was generally designed for those courses that had an exam so that the gradebook could calculate properly.
So the process that we went to in reviewing this policy is that there was a district grading committee that consisted of content experts, teachers, administrators, ILEDs, the Instructional Leadership Executive Directors, that first reviewed both research-based best practices and practices from other districts. And we use that information to create the survey and the protocol for our in-person sessions that we use to get feedback from the field. And then based on the responses from that survey and from the discussions we've had so far and the discussions that we will continue to have, we applied the proposed policy revisions in front of you today.
So again, and in those content experts, since we're stemming today, were there STEM teachers outside of mathematics or a part of that conversation? Or arts teachers?
So we had, no. We had a general elementary school teacher, so that teacher teaches subjects beyond English and math. but we did not have a specific STEM, not math secondary teacher. But hopefully their feedback was accounted for in the 537 teachers who did do the survey. And we also, so we had 1,000 students respond. We had 428 parents and members of our community respond, and counselors and administrators. So I'm not going to go through every question we asked and the ratios of answers, but those have been included in the appendix of your presentation.
I'd just like to offer that a student that's typically developing and on track at the secondary level has 1 hour of English a day and 1 hour of math, which means the other 2/3 of their day are in the other content areas. And if we really want to address the achievement disparities we're seeing, and we continue to not include the other 2/3 of the student's day, we're unlikely to really move the needle on English and math instruction. So I'm challenged by that, and I know
Yeah.
this is not an attack at all. It is just a frustration of the continued discourse about the marginalization of content areas and the lack of showing up for students in a
So-
whole child way.
So to make sure I understand the critique, what you're saying is because the policy includes examination grades, that it is designed mostly for the English and math circumstance, so therefore
Well,
we're
and
neglecting
your
the other
inclusion of
subjects?
teachers, if there's not physics teachers in the room, if there's not, vocal music teachers in the room, you're gonna miss that voice in really helping identify curricular gaps. Oh, we can't do this because we don't have common formative assessments, let's get on that. Those kinds of pieces. Commissioner Lynn?
Yes. Can you, I'm sorry if I get this wrong, please correct me, but specific survey, is this an audience of, did you take this around the school? How did you gather this information?
So the surveys were disseminated online. The questions were changed a little bit depending on who we were asking the questions to. For the parent and community member group, I did go to the choice fair and had a computer set up for some of those parents to answer those questions that way.
Where did the
Yeah.
1,014 students come? That's
So what we did there, that's also a digital survey. Chief Conley sent a email out to schools sharing a small PowerPoint about the grading policy, about what grading policy is, what grading policy isn't, and asked schools to take 10 minutes to make sure that the students saw the PowerPoint and answered the survey questions based on their opinions from that.
Was this all schools, or was it,
It was sent to all schools.
and just the response was just 1,000 students? For
Correct.
all schools together?
Correct.
Okay. And for the one student panel, when did that happen?
So that, I can get the exact date for you. And we did go to ASCBC as well.
Okay.
From the student but it included students from the Baltimore Algebra Project, and it actually included, it was mostly secondary students, so high school students, but it represented a good cross-section of our high schools. It included charters, it included selective criteria, it included AOPs, and it included non-selective criteria high schools.
And I have a question not related to this, but so with your grading policy, is there a way for schools to, if they were to create their grading policy, is there any loophole or any way that a school can, I wouldn't say like kick a grade, but let's say a D. It doesn't need to, they don't want a D, and it's not in their grading policy. Can they actually do that? And if so, why is that possible?
So can you explain a little bit more the scenario you're getting at?
I mean, just, like if a school doesn't have like a grade that a different school has, is that possible?
So can I give an example? So like, say Bard Early College decides we want to go gradeless. Can they? Or we don't want to do pluses and minuses. And it's in the regulations, but if you could share that.
So technically, a school can ask for a waiver from the policy as written, so that is allowable. I think for the specific GPA standards or the types of grades that you have, because the regulation outlines the percentage ranges that align to a certain grade, then schools would have to get a waiver to go gradeless. So school can't just say, we don't want to give D's or C's.
Sorry. So it potentially matters more with percentages rather than grades, right? Well, like letter grades.
So, I'm sorry.
If you
what
get my
matters
question.
more?
In the regulations, it's exactly spelled out what percentage equates to what letter grade. So they have to adhere to that. If they choose not to adhere to that, they have to ask for a waiver from us.
And
Yeah.
and I believe, Josh, you attend City. So, what Principal Harcum does there, she does. So one, she does and she was one of the administrators on our panel. So she does standards-based grading at her school, and many of her classes are IB classes, as you know. So, I believe you get grades from 1 to 7. They are equated to certain percentages and certain letter grades within our scale. So that's how City College applies to that, and they have their grading policy communicated to you and on their website.
But at City College, there's no. That's what I'm saying. Like, did they get a waiver to take out, because we don't have D's? So that's why I'm asking. So, is there like? That's why I'm asking. Is it based more on percentages rather than, like? I don't know if I'm getting it through
Yeah,
correctly.
I totally understand what you're asking. So several years ago, when we were working with Power Teacher Gradebook as our gradebook and implementing Infinite Campus, we had long conversations with Principal Harcum about the IB scale and the need for that particular school to have a different set of grades that are reported for students because of the IB program. And if we didn't do that, there was a risk that the program would no longer be able to stay at the school. And so part of that conversation was working with her to identify on a percentage scale of 1 to 100, what does a 1 in the IB scale correlate to in a percentage, so that the grade book, which has to have a percentage in order to calculate, could calculate an appropriate grade and GPA for the students at City. So yes, she did ask for a waiver. We did make sure it was done, and it was when it was before, it was when Rudy Ruiz was here, but there was an email correspondence and a series of meetings, and we did make sure that everything that she was doing within that IB scale still aligned with policy in terms of there's a percentage, and making sure that everybody understood what the 1 meant in terms of the percentage. Does that answer your question? Okay.
So then, as we move forward with this, as we look to codify things and make things a little bit more systematized, or that's what it feels like, maybe reaching out to anyone that's doing a variable and asking them to put forth their waivers all in the same bucket to help the board colleagues kind of track what's happening rather than piecemeal here and there, to make sure that it's the least impact on schools.
Yep, and I think, and I'm sorry, I got a sore throat. One of the things, I'm okay for now. One of the things that we need to do better is actually collecting all the grading policies, ensuring that they're disseminated in some sort of public way, and also documenting the waivers. So reviewing this, I think the current regulation, and one of the things that we need to fix between first and second reader is about the posting on school websites. So one, I'm not sure what percentage of grading policies were posted on school websites, but it certainly wasn't 100% previously. But we've also changed how we do our school websites with our new website. So that is something we're aware of that we know we need to figure out between now and the second reader process.
Additionally, if there's a philosophical lens, are we looking to standards-based grading? Are we looking to mastery?
Yeah.
And being really transparent for teachers and principals on what that means, and parents.
Yeah. So I'm glad you asked that question. You must have done your reading in advance. So what we did in researching best practices from other districts what we found is standards-based grading is where the research told us to go. So what standards-based grading is it would be a complete change of how our report cards look, how we ask our teachers to grade and do their work. So it would say you might get a score for math from 1 to 4, with 4 being outstanding, 3 being meets expectations, 2 being below, and 1 being woefully below. And you would get an overall grade for math, and beneath that, it's like, can I do addition? Can I do subtraction? Can I do multiplication? That's a complete change from where we are now, and when we looked at our capacity right now so we surveyed our teachers on standards-based grading and the amount of support that they would need to make that transition, and they indicated that they would need a major amount of support to do that transition. And we looked at what Baltimore County did when they rolled out standards-based grading, and the initial implementation of that was rough. And we also looked at who would actually do that work here, and we couldn't identify anyone that already wasn't doing 125% of their job on something else. So as much as I would love to present to you the 3 to 4 year plan for towards standards-based grading today, the committee in our review just didn't see ourselves in a position to do that. So what we did is we looked at what was second best. And first we looked at what our stakeholders said to us. So they indicated that grades should reflect mastery. They also indicated though that non-mastery based components should be included in the grading calculation. So several folks indicated that you should grade the practice that they do before the test. You should, some even indicated that you should grade attendance and behavior, which is not where we propose going there. We also talked about the autonomy at the school level, asked about the autonomy at the school level versus decentralization. What we saw with that is that teachers and parents generally wanted autonomy to set their own grading policy, while administrators preferred a centralized standard. So in our initial proposal here before you today, some of that autonomy is still maintained. And autonomy and equity don't have to be completely competing values, but one of the things that that in our office, members of our team process each of the report cards. And we do see that the grade books from school to school look entirely different. Sometimes we only see a few assignments representing the entirety of a student's whole grade. And then we know that especially on the K through 8 side, where we use one composite score to determine who gets access to certain programming in our city, it is also important from an equity perspective to have some bounds around that autonomy as well. And so where we ended up in our proposed next slide aligns with what other urban districts are doing. So we considered all those factors in making this first recommendation. Boy, that ended up small. So first, schools would still set their own grading policies, but our proposal is that a minimum of 70% of the grade would be based on summative components. A maximum of 30% of the grade, that should say formative, not completion, but would be on formative components, including completion. And then no more than 10% of the overall grade, or 1/3 of that formative section, would be based on could be based on homework.
So with this focus towards mastery, any parameters, and I didn't see them in the regs, so around number of options for retakes.
Yep.
You know, if we're going to standards-based and a mastery, and my student Ronald fails a test, I need to give him how many options over how can a period of time
And so that's
to demonstrate that.
So that's actually we'd love to hear you guys on that. So I had a chance to share this with ILEDs last week, and one of the things that is in there is an encouragement to do retakes up until the end of the grading period, and to have that retake replace the previous grade. One of the things that the ILEDs actually challenged me on, besides still allowing schools to have some flexibility in the grading process, is actually extending that retake window beyond the first quarter, and that gets in because mastery changes over time. Should they be held back for what they did first quarter, then they learned how to do addition in the second quarter. On the flip side, we have a grade change guidance as well, and so we would have to put systems and processes in place. So I think that's something that we can clarify more as we do guidance to the regulation. But right now where we are is encouraging schools to offer retakes to students, but without standardizing what that looks like.
So then, again, to build off of that, when we look about mastery, again, if this is a comprehensive grading policy, and at the elementary school, according to the regs, we're proficient, not proficient, there's just 3.
Yeah.
Are those, crosswalked with anything, or is it, Teacher Berkeley and Teacher Lynn decide what proficient's going to look like, especially even within English and math, as we're looking for possibly a replacement to iReady?
Yep. So that's a great question. So one of the things that we need to be crystal clear when we implement is around what counts in what category. This is more of a challenge than you might think. So, for example, our average ninth grader right now, I believe, comes in at a fifth grade level, district-wide. So, if a teacher chooses to scaffold standards that lead up to the ninth grade standards, the way this policy is written right now, or these regs are written right now, a student who gets taught and masters the aligned 7th grade standard or the aligned 8th grade standard would get credit for that work in the mastery section of the regulation, even if they aren't up to the 9th grade standard yet, because they were assessed on what they taught and they either got it or they didn't. So the assignments that would have to be, because we have such a diverse set of schools, the assignments that make the students grade from place to place have to look different, and we need to be flexible enough to allow for that while stating our value that the grade should reflect overall, as much as possible, the mastery of what they got taught at that time. So I would argue that in the 9th grade year, if a student came in at the 5th grade level and left 9th grade at the 7th grade level, that's a great year of learning for that student and a great year of teaching, and that should be rewarded in the grade that they got, even if their PARCC score might not be at the end of that year where it would need to be.
Yeah, I got to think, I'm like, okay, if we have historically had a few high schools that say have 0 kids proficient in math, are we back mapping that to say, oh, did they all go home with not proficient elementary report cards, or did they go home in 6th grade with, something to hang on their fridge, and then all of a sudden parents are being, whoa, what happened?
Yeah, that would be fascinating. I'd anticipate with this shift, many of the
And I'm not asking anybody to do that work. You've got way too much to do. It just is one of those philosophical things that if it matters, again, it matters to do it well.
So, keeping it moving, the next change, the next proposed change is changing the entry of grades from twice a month to once per week for teachers. There is a little nuance there because a few schools apparently have assignments that take more than a week to complete. If that's legitimately happening, that's fine as well.
So, Danny, I'll pop in here. This was actually the biggest reason I wondered who your teacher body was. Because if you have classes that only see their students once a week, or if you're doing quality inquiry investigations that take time, then adding a grade once a week is a really sort of just a to-do task that has no connection to learning or mastery.
Got it.
And in addition to that, there's very little to no language throughout that count artistic, physical, or creative tasks. It's written work, it's worksheets, it's homework, but there's nothing that acknowledges the breadth and depth of what quality assessment work should be.
That's great feedback, thank you. One of the interesting things is that a plurality of teachers did say that weekly was a fair expectation, but I should disaggregate that and look at the different subject
Yeah, if you only have
levels.
elementary generalists who have something they could enter weekly
Yeah.
and they see their students every day, or semester-long or trimester classes, it's a very different data pool to pull from for assessment.
One of the things that we wanted to share, to reaffirm publicly, is our proposal to keep the minimum quarterly grade of 50% in, and now that water would be great, in that, in our policy. The reason, thank you so much. The reason for that, is primarily is that it's key to our re-engagement strategy. So a student who, so students who are re-engaged often do the math, and they realize that, if I do, even if I do what I'm supposed to during the second half of the year, I might not be able to move on to the next grade. So as a district, we believe that students should have multiple opportunities to demonstrate success, and this is consistent with that. On the flip side, we did hear from parents and teachers that it sends a message that you're already halfway there without even having to try, and so we recognize that criticism as well, especially as we go to a more mastery-based framework. However, just in terms of our values, in terms of re-engaging our students and knowing that we do have students in this district to re-engage, we wanted to reaffirm and share the why of why we do this. And students agree with us, and administrators/counselors agree with us in their feedback.
So, yeah, and Christian, could you grab another cup? Thank you. So a challenge with that is if we're going to mastery.
Yep.
And whether standards-based mastery or some other formulation of mastery, many of our disengaged students are disengaged because they're really, really brilliant. So if they were to come in and say, oh, I need to meet standards and knock it out in a week, then do we force them to have seat time for the next half of the semester? Or could they achieve mastery and move on to using that time to hit another content area or accelerate their learning or get a CTE certificate? So that's my challenge with keeping it at 50%.
Yep.
Is if we truly, or a traditional sophomore, all of a sudden, I've met my biology standards, now I'm ready to enter my chemistry standards. Are they stuck there with sitting in a chair for the rest of the semester?
Yeah, so one of the things that we should look at is there is credit by exam on the books that we've never really expanded upon about when it's supposed to be used. Right now, use of that option is done on a case-by-case basis. So to your point, that's a place where we can look. The other thing, in a previous iteration of this, we actually had a version of if the mastery grade was higher than the overall grade, the students would get that mastery grade, sort of like how college works. It doesn't matter if you show up to the class, but if you do the assignments well, you get that. Unfortunately, from a technical perspective, there was no way to do that in a transparent manner with our current systems. And we would also have a ton of work to do to codify that piece in terms of what counts for a mastery grade. So that was, but we did look into that.
And especially as schools go to more project-based learning, that's going to hit multiple standards for multiple content areas in the same project. If they do a simple machines unit in 5th grade through design features, now they've hit boom, do they need to go through, emerging physics in 6th grade, things like that.
So some other things that less major proposed revisions that we did do. There's a statement in there articulating that we do have grade change guidelines. One of the things that we got in our survey was that teachers were generally unaware of the guidelines that we produced last year. So we'll take that feedback and making sure we better communicate to teachers their rights in the grade change process. There will be a statement articulating that AP and IB grades should be aligned with their authorizing organization. We made language shifts to make it apply to multiple student information systems. Some of the language in there was specific to SMS, which we no longer use. And we never updated the GPA calculation in there, so that's in there now, and that's a big deal.
So a piece to consider for that is in the regs under, sorry, skipping around in my notes. Under regulations, letter F, number 2, letter G, 1A, where it says that an incomplete can be changed, it doesn't have any timeline for that.
Mm-hmm.
So right now it's sitting as an indefinite, so I could come back as a 26-year-old and say, change that. So you might want to tighten that.
Okay. Thank you. So I do want to communicate to the public that we're still taking survey responses up until the first reader point. Up until first reader, so the next version of this presentation will be updated with updated results. So we want to encourage that. Also, we'll be doing a Facebook Live at 4 p.m. on March 7th around this. And I'm in the process of finalizing the location for 2 additional in-person sessions, which I believe will be March 3rd and March 5th, thinking one on the east side, one on the west side for that, so that we can get more public input between now and first reader, which I believe is March 26th, or second reader, whatever we call it now. And then, so those are the survey links that anyone from the public can copy and paste in. And then the stakeholder engagement we've done so far is we've gone to ASCBC and PCAB. We have emailed these proposed changes to our partners at BTU and Pizzazza. Since this presentation was drafted, I've had a chance to talk to Allison and ILEDs and Chief Davis and Chief Conley, so we have engaged our senior district leadership, and currently the Teacher Democracy Project and Be More Rank and File are also reviewing what we've proposed here today, and we still have a few more stakeholder presentations to go. So we'll continue to collect that and bring that to the next discussion.
Fabulous. So before I open it to more questions, I just want to really let you know, this is a heavy lift, and it's a 9-headed hydra, because as soon as you start doing it, it comes up, what are our assessments, where's our curriculum, what about? So understand that we know and appreciate the challenge that lays ahead of us, especially when we lack an infrastructure of, a single data system that's going to help track standards vertically and horizontally for kids. So, any commissioner questions? No,
I'm processing. I'll send them.
okay.
So
Well,
one thing
I have.
So one thing I would like to generally get out of this conversation is the general feedback around whether the numbers are correct or incorrect, but more than that, whether still having some school-based autonomy in setting the grading policy, but creating some additional bounds is the right way to go, as opposed to continuing where we are without those bounds, or going to a single district standard in terms of what category weights count for what.
The feedback that I've gotten from teachers is that this really could happen through curriculum. So if there were those expectations of scope and sequence timelines, generally, certainly not a scripted, and in the encore content areas, having common assessments. And so a student, for the best interest of the student that transfers from school A to school B, that they know that their physics experience, their chemistry experience is going to be roughly the same, would do a lot to help this. And really support. And that way it's not something else being put upon or forced or record keeping, but it's just part of the organic process of teaching and learning. A couple pieces that I have on the policy document under Roman numeral 3, letter A, just request, you use the word kids.
Whoops.
Just thinking about students. And then looking at any time that we use the word all, so in that first sentence, it says all kids. If we could change that to each student, just shifts the level of responsibility to really look at who's sitting with you in your classroom. There's just a couple places where in the wordsmithing and the track changes, the grammar just got really messed up in there. So I'm sure that will get cleaned up when those track changes come out. In the first paragraph, in the paragraph about kids, where it says delete and following removed mandate, the tone of the paragraph seems really negative and reactive. And I don't know if there's a way we can shift language to be a proactive and positive. So we're not grading to be punitive, but we are ensuring you are able to access high-quality post-secondary experiences. We want to make sure we don't let kids fall through the cracks, that everybody's meeting mastery, something along those lines, and that could just be me. I don't know if others felt that. And under Roman numeral 5, letter B, number 2, again, the grammar, it says a timely upkeep of grades is important to inform student progress for teachers, parents, and students. Well, we're not really informing student progress. We're informing students of their progress, things like that that's super picky, but it's going to matter, and ease it through first reader. In the regulations, again, the philosophical statement, with that reporting on a weekly basis, I'm wondering if we really have the capacity, especially for those teachers who are seeing 100 to 300 students a week, and what professional development will accompany this rollout to make sure for principals, EDs, and teachers.
So quick
Yeah.
question there. So one of the reasons we brought this up at this time is some elements of our policy have become big public issues. With that being said, one of the things we'd like to consider is an opportunity to pilot the new policy in a few schools before going to full implementation. Is that something that is possible given the public nature of some of the questions that came up?
I would think that would come to a management issue more than a governance issue. And I think that governance would probably be very amenable to it if we knew the timeline when we could expect, but as far as the capacity, I really trust our leadership here to know what's feasible. And sometimes we all know in education, you need to go a little slower in order to go fast. Because a poor implementation will have us at this table 5 years from now going, how should we do this?
Yep.
So that's, and that is my voice. That is not, we haven't had a collective conversation on that. But I certainly can add that to our agenda to chat about.
Yeah, no, makes sense.
Okay.
I'm looking at the policy also where it is in, I guess, number 4, the implementation strategies, letter B, number 3, where it discusses interim reports, interim progress reporting. And then the recommendation is that teachers, it's in blue, should notify students and guardians as soon as there's an indication that a student is not performing at a satisfactory level at any point in the marking period. Should that be should, or should we make it clear that that must be a
It's an
practice? It's an expectation in practice. It's almost like if a student does, like if you get it's tough for me to see how a student can fail a course if they didn't fail midway, if they're not failing midway, if that makes sense.
Yep.
So I think the ongoing conversation should be has to happen prior to the end of a marking period,
Yep. So
especially with that 50,
Yes.
the 50%. That's the lowest score possible.
So the idea there is a progress report, but sometimes that comes too late. So there should be, and so your feedback is well taken in that how the language should work. But if students are in trouble before that progress report comes out, the teacher should be letting the student know. And so that's the general idea there. I think to make sure I have the feedback correct, Commissioner McFadden, it's the difference between should and must, or how do we state that expectation that is regularly happening, right?
Thank you. And then also in Roman numeral 3, in the recommended portion, city schools acknowledges that student mastery can be that sentence. And then the next one starts with city schools acknowledges that our students face obstacles that hinder performance. Thus, I'm assuming the intent in that, but are all of our students facing obstacles that may be hindering their progress? Are we grouping them all together in the same?
That's the positive proactive sentence I was referring to earlier.
Okay.
But thank you for finding it, because I didn't have.
I just think we should, I don't know, that many of our students or some of our students experience these, but not all of our students. I think that's important to Commissioner James Hassan's point.
Well, I also think it's important in an engagement strategy in recruiting new students. If I'm a
Absolutely.
parent and I read
Families.
all the students here are really challenged, I'm
Absolutely.
going to go, well, I'd rather find some place where my child can find some peers, or where there's diversity within challenge.
I agree.
So I already mentioned the Roman numeral 3 under guidelines, letter 2, changing the G1A, the timeline for changing an incomplete. But then also there's a set of columns there about what percentage of grades equal an A+ and an A. In just ensuring that first column is percentage, it's not listed, it just says 90 to 100. And so somebody could come through and say, oh, I have to have 100 points I give in my semester. Again, a little teeny tiny detail, but I could see that holding things up. And then my last point is on weighted grades and the relationship between weighted grades and equity. Because if you don't have a family or an advocate as a young person that is channeling you to an IB program or channeling you to an AP program, then your maximum GPA is a 4.0. So we're doubling down the ability to access and leverage post-secondary experiences for a lot of our kids by giving weighted grades. Yes, there's some conversation, will they compete with Baltimore County kids or Montgomery County kids to be able to get into Vassar and Brown or wherever they want to go if they don't have a 4.4 or a 4.6. But if our district says our max is a 4.0, then now they all have equal access to Vassar and Brown and Dartmouth and UMBC. And so I would be interested at minimum to know what numbers for Commissioner Bondima channeling or percentage of the kids that graduated with of a 4.0, what were their racial demographics and their farm status? Because it feels to me like it's inequitable and creates a systemic inequity, but maybe it doesn't in Baltimore. I don't know. But if it is creating a systemic inequity, then I won't want to pass a policy that perpetuates that. So,
Dr. Pfeiffer, do you want to chime in on sort of how colleges review students' grades versus their peers, either district-wide or school-wide?
I think you make a great point. Students are reviewed typically in school group, and so a college would be looking at students from a particular school when taking that into consideration. And I will just note that the issue isn't just on the high school level, because we do have honors courses that are available in some of our schools and middle schools, so it's something that we can take a closer look at.
I would appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Because I think we could also be a national leader in saying this is actually what equity really means, is looking at, from a policy soup to nuts level, how are we creating or interrupting barriers.
And if I could ask just for clarity, because the reason it was originally instated was because of the increased rigor in the coursework that students were taking at honors and those levels. So regardless of the particular rigor of the course, that the grading would remain the same.
Because the course title doesn't change. So as a parent, my son, AP Biology, AP English was not the same as traditional English or traditional biology. So on a feeling level, on a parent level, I knew that the College Board was going to see the difference in that. But to have it glaringly stand out as first filter, this kid with a 4.0 just fell to space 35 in Baltimore City. That's a challenge. Again, kudos. This is big job, big work, and I'm sure it's including lots and lots of departments from around, legal challenges, and it's a public thing because it's the number they walk away with. So really appreciate the conscientious work on it.
All right, thank you, guys.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
The next policy meeting will be Tuesday, March 19th from 3:30 to 5:30 in this room, where we'll discuss BDF, which is Parent Community Advisory Board, BBA, which is Board Powers and Responsibilities, HIB, which is Public Charter Schools, and the Equity Policy. With that said, Mr. Gant, do we have any public comment today? Okay. Anyone in the gallery that would like to address the board? Yeah. They're people too. All right, with that, we are officially adjourned at 4:38 p.m. Thank you.